Hello, welcome to Drugs Unwrapped. I'm Rob. Today we are talking about the A word, alcohol, and ultimately is our relationship with the phenomenon that is booze changing. With me today is Jamie, service manager for Swansea Services, Sarah, who is our Gwent Engage service manager, and also Hannah, who is a transitional worker based in Cumtaff and Bridgend. So we'll crack on. Sarah, if we come to you, the first thing I ultimately want to kind of get out there is ultimately what is our relationship with alcohol. Why, from your perspective, do we as a population, as a society, why do we have this relationship with alcohol, which we have to remember is ultimately a drug? So why do you think alcohol is such a prominent part of many people's lives?
Do you know what? I think for me, it's not just that alcohol is socially accepted. I think it's actually that it's socially expected. I feel like, particularly in kind of British culture, from a relatively young age, it's everywhere. And there's that expectation that as soon as you get to a certain age, you will use alcohol as a way to relax, as a way to have fun, but also it'll be there as your sort of your crux and your coping mechanism at times of stress, times of worry, times of anxiety. So I think then, because it's associated with our sort of broad spectrum of feelings and emotions, it just becomes a big part of pretty much the majority of the population's lives in some way. So yeah, for me, it's that social expectation rather than it just being accepted.
From a young person's perspective, because obviously you manage young people, then is that something that you come across in terms of, we talk about like peer pressure and peer preference. Is that a big thing within young people when it comes to alcohol, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as with all substances that we see in our service, we see a really wide spectrum of use. So, we see young people coming into service where they are drinking quite excessive amounts of alcohol, your typical sort of binge drinking. But because there's that social expectation around that, they often don't enter service because of alcohol use. We primarily see young people coming into service or being referred for cannabis use or other substances. And then when we're doing assessments, we might find out, okay, they're using cannabis, a relatively small amount of cannabis a few times a week, but then they're drinking an excessive amount of alcohol on the weekends. That's expected, so they don't see that as something they need to access support or treatment for. But for us as young persons workers, that's ultimately the thing that we would focus on first, because that's where that excessive amount of alcohol use is hugely increasing harms and risks with young people. That those situations that they find themselves in when drinking excessive amounts of alcohol means they're often putting themselves in really vulnerable positions. So yeah, I think it all plays a really big part in terms of what we see within our service.
And to bring Hannah and Jamie in terms of from your perspectives, are those similar kind of themes that you see? Hannah, if we come to you first.
Yeah, I think when I'm assessing young people, and including when I've worked with under 18s as well, it tends to be that they've been referred in for a substance, and then there's actually underlying alcohol use. And I think, I'd agree with Sarah in terms of that they don't identify that as an issue, but I think as well, a lot of mine are referred in by professionals, and I think it's also then that the professionals don't see that as a problem necessarily, because it's normalised to us as adults that, we do drink, and then the alarm bells ring around the substances, and we're blind to actually the harms of alcohol. But I think as well with the young people I work with in my area, there's much less alcohol use and more substance use from a young age. So
Is it a case then in terms of like with alcohol, like it's got to get to such like a high level? If you're using a substance, cannabis or cocaine or ketamine, then potential low level of that drug could be seen as something that is quite harmful. But compare it to alcohol, then actually, because of its social status and its social acceptance, that actually there's such a high bar in terms of it potentially being seen as quite harmful, that that is maybe a reason then why potentially people aren't coming forward and necessarily seeing it as an issue, even though they're drinking like what you would associate it to an excess compared to like the government guidelines. James, I know you were going to come in then. So
no, I just think like it's quite a complex discussion in relation to when you think about like the history of alcohol is as long and as complex one, and it's dating back like thousands of years, isn't it? And then you compare that to cannabis, which, as we know as well, which is very much a herbal product and is a plant matter and has been in communities and societies for thousands of years also. But for the reason or whatever, the stigmatization in the use of cannabis and compared to like the fermentation of grapes and barley and oats, etc., and how that superseded everything. When you think back to like, religion and how the monks kind of like created monasteries and refined ways in which you can create and redefine alcohol to make it as it is sometimes an acquired taste, but how you can bring it into the fabric of society from a religious perspective. And then like fast forward to this day and age and seeing the cultural nuances and acceptance of alcohol in some religions and not others, but in other societies and not others. It is a complicated, multifaceted kind of way you're thinking about how and why are we at the place that we're at today. And when you look at the prohibitionist approach in the US and how that started and stopped, and and look where they are with their relationship and love affair with alcohol to where we are to this day. And it's about like revisiting the ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, the Middle Ages, and explore the history of alcohol and how we are where we are. Fast forward then again to like a young person's perspective and seeing what they see in their communities and societies and behind closed door within their family networks, and how alcohol is treated with some respect in some ways and quite frivolous in others. Then when it comes to having a good time and over indulgence in that, creating and some complexities. Also, we also know the medicinal purposes of why some people deal with and drink alcohol, because of like whether people are experience trauma. So it's quite a very deep-seated kind of discussion in regards to our relationship with alcohol and and how it has changed. But there's been a constant on it, the demand and two, the supply.
I think it's interesting, what you said there, Jamie, about like religion and location and things like that, because it's like I was just thinking now, like I went to a church in Wales primary school, and just thinking that the communion that I was seeing as like below 10 years old, you got the bread and the wine.
Yeah,
even in that
I'm
situation.
Roman Catholic, and brought up in a Roman Catholic school and environment as well, where alcohol is obviously a big part of everything.
Definitely, I've got Irish family, and alcohol's a massive part there, and within the religion, and you see it really kind of prominent, and just within religion, and especially when you think about like kind of like sinful activity and things like that. Actually, alcohol is very much part of any kind of religious ceremony, and it's not counted within a lot of kind of sinful activity when it's in ritual. And I think in terms of location, like you were saying about cannabis, okay, that's been around for thousands of years, but when you think about us and our relationship in the UK, is a very specific thing with alcohol, thinking about where cannabis grows, where the coca leaf grows. But actually, looking at it historically, you've got the Romans coming in, so feast drinking, you've got the Norse coming in, the Vikings, and that kind of celebratory drinking, and how that kind of culture has kind of come to a head as a hot spot in the UK as well. So it's like you've got the ritual side of things within different religions, and then the kind of that kind of feast celebratory element of alcohol as well. So we are like almost like a hub. So it's no surprise that we've developed this kind of famous relationship with alcohol as Brits.
So is it like we're seeing then two strands to it? We're seeing like the historical development of alcohol, right? And also how our personal development and our personal relationship with alcohol has kind of like developed alongside that, evolving.
I think so.
I have to say, I never expected monks to be mentioned, and Romans and Norsemen. You two have just blown my mind. I'm like, oh my days.
We haven't even started on why we use alcohol, which is is this podcast how long?
I think it's going to be like 2 hours.
2
This
hours.
one. I think so. Yeah, we're going way back in time. Absolutely, without a doubt. So, Sarah, to bring you back in then. So you mentioned about like coming of age then. So what is it then about alcohol and that kind of coming of age from a young person's perspective? What is that all about?
I think just because of that social expectation, it's around, you know, that celebration that you're at the age now where you can drink alcohol. If you look around the supermarkets at like birthday cards, 18 birthday cards, 21 birthday cards, any age actually, birthday cards are all related to alcohol. A lot of them are, have a gin-tastic birthday. So it's there, it's actively promoted, and I think it's about, as a culture, we've just created this space where there's that expectation that you will be part of that culture and that you will celebrate becoming a young person or a young adult, or you'll start to I guess push boundaries by drinking alcohol.
I think as a personal development, as an individual, as you grow and mature, our attitudes and behavior towards alcohol very often changes. Many of us may become more responsible with our alcohol and with age, and the way we consume it as well. But we also gain some insight and better understanding of alcohol and its effects. And I think, in this day and age around like well-being and stuff like that, we are very much attuned in and switched on now to the actual effects of alcohol. And I think we are mindful of our well-being. Could we honestly say between the four of us here today, like is our relationship with alcohol the same as it was when we were 18? No, I don't think so. And some of us may have not a chance in it. And also maybe, and also for some people, it might be the other way around. Maybe experience and knowledge and use of alcohol at 18 was limited, but now is probably more. So it's got a lot to do, I think, about personal development and having an understanding and insight, like all drugs and alcohol, really. But I think it's about personal development and how your relationship grows with alcohol.
But I think as well with young people, what we tend to find is, or with anyone really, is that the majority of people will test it out.
Yeah.
Whereas you won't find that with all substances.
No.
If you ask the majority of the population past the age of sort of 15, 16, the majority will have likely tried alcohol and tested it out. Whereas if you ask that for another substance like cocaine or cannabis, you're not going to find as high a percentage have tested it out.
So testing it out as in like they're getting drunk and seeing what it's like, and if they enjoy it and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think even just trying it, it's quite normal for you as a young person to have, your mum, your dad, your older sibling, your uncle, your auntie, somebody to kind of, pull you to the side at your Christmas dinner and be like, oh, go on, have a taste of this, I won't tell your mum or whatever. Like almost like a peer pressure type thing, but because it's alcohol, it's like, oh, it's fine, I'm giving them their first drink. Like it's so normalized. Whereas if you flip that and say, your auntie or your uncle or your older sibling pulled you to the side and said, have a line of Coke, it'd be like, okay, actually, that's really damaging. That's really harmful. Why would you do that to somebody that's too young to have that type thing? So it's like, just because our attitudes are so normal.
Yeah. Or even a cigarette, like if you keep it in the legal status, if that scenario instead of alcohol, or have a fag, like I think most people around the table would be like, whoa, what are you doing?
What are you doing? Yeah, definitely.
Because it's booze. It's like...
It's so normal. And again, it's that rite of passage, or I gave them their first drink type thing, so
life event, isn't it? It's that life
Yeah,
event, it's a
definitely.
sequence in our life. Like, you know, I know no one else mentioned like personal development, but then there's key stages as well, life events such as coming of age, being out in the park with in your early teens, that experimental phase, or having that drink with the family, becoming a parent, experiencing loss, you know, a wake, graduation, new employment, loss of jobs, all those kind of things. And alcohol seems to factor and feature, you know, and especially because, like, you know, being Welsh as well, being brought up in, you know, the rugby culture, the adverts, the social and the working men's clubs that we've had from industry, and how alcohol has always been, you know, quite heavily promoted through time and industrial kind of areas as well. So we're very much akin to that, and it's just the fabric of our society that we're speaking about.
I was going to ask, like, how do young people afford it? Because, like, I don't really drink that much. I'll drink every now and again. I think the last beer I had genuinely was in August, right? Start of August. Me and my wife went to the pub. We had childcare because I was at my parents'. So we were like, oh, we'll go out for a drink. We went to the pub. I think I had a pint. My wife had, I think, Crabbies. Came to nearly 12 quid. I was like,
it's expensive.
oh my days, like, how did this get so expensive? But how do young people afford it then?
Yeah, I used to go out
like a
all
lot
night
of
on
the
12
time.
quid.
Yeah.
I think
That's
a lot
true.
of the time it's tolerance as well, though, because it's like I was just thinking now, like, just listen to what everyone said, like on the IDing thing. I like just thinking about how strict it is, like talking about licensing. I'm 24. I do not ever not get ID'd. I'm always ID'd.
Stop going off.
No, but
I don't
do you
get
know
that
what I mean?
problem.
Like, that's how stringent they are.
I
That,
wish
you
I
know,
did.
even people who know me, and when I'm with a group of people who, you know, do look obviously older, I am always ID'd. You know, there was no
All right,
chance I
you've
was
said
ever.
that once already.
There was no chance. I wasn't 18 for my prom night. There was no chance I was sneaking into a town. You know, there was no way. But I think, you know, in terms of the cost, like just thinking to when, you know, I was a teenager, I think tolerance plays into it, because you could get a bottle of WKD and, you know, when you're first starting to drink, you're probably gone by the end of the night off just one big bottle of WKD. I think people are, you know, it's what they drink as well. Like you're looking like Frosty Jacks, Lambrini, like those cheaper drinks, like a bottle of Echo Falls. They're all like kind of below the £7 mark, but they're higher percentage. And then I suppose you're talking about risk of exploitation then as well, asking people to buy your alcohol for you, favours and things like that. But I think it's interesting to think about that cost, because it plays into what I've seen a lot, which is people moving away from alcohol. So a lot of the young people that I have worked with, you know, I'm working with people who are, you know, 17 to 25, and they're saying that the first drug they tried, even possibly before they tried alcohol, was MDMA. And they're saying that it's cheaper to get a pill than to go and buy alcohol and get an effect from the alcohol. And it's also easier to get a pill than it is to try and find someone to sneak into a shop, to go into a shop and buy you alcohol and give it to you. And that's something I've always found really, really interesting, of, you know, why that shift is happening. And it's actually to do with costs and accessibility.
So obviously, like the financial implications then are having an impact, really. So from a young person kind of like perspective as a whole, then are you kind of obviously you mentioned in terms of actually potentially people coming in to services seeking support for other drugs, and then obviously once they're in services, they're then disclosing that alcohol use. Is it much of an issue then, really, within young people, if that is the case, would you say, or actually is it quite a hidden issue in terms of the harms that young people are presenting?
In my experience, it varies, and I get a lot of people who come in and they say, I just want to be able to use something, have fun and walk away from it. And generally, I think the young people I work with, either drugs and alcohol are intertwined and they have a problematic relationship with both and they feel like they need to use both to excess, or they see drugs as a very separate thing to alcohol. And, you know, I see quite a lot of the time people saying that they use substances, but they don't drink at all. And I see people who use substances, and when you say to them, what about your alcohol use? Either it's, I can't drink without wanting to use Coke, or it's, yeah, I drink sometimes, but I'm not that arsed. And I think it's you're seeing this kind of split in young people, of young people who are very against alcohol and who potentially view substances as safe compared to alcohol, rather than just noticing that there's varying degrees of harm, because this kind of message of alcohol is actually quite harmful is more in society now. And I think maybe that's being misconstrued as alcohol is dangerous and drugs are safe. But then you also get people like I've worked with people between the ages of 18 and 25 who are alcohol dependent and are going for detox as well. So I think it really depends, but you are definitely seeing this kind of shift in knowledge around the harms of alcohol permeating a lot more towards young people. Like, as a 24-year-old, a lot of my friends don't drink, or if they do, it's very rare. In university, I went, to Birmingham. It's quite a party uni, and a lot of people just didn't drink. It was much less popular. I think there was a sober society as well that was quite popular. So it's definitely like that cultural shift, I think, and it's coming through this like new generation of people.
Yeah, and Sarah, from your perspective, like with young people as a whole, then to kind of like wrap up young people, obviously you've been involved in YP services for a few years. Like, have you seen ultimately maybe where alcohol in young people was, say, 5-10 years ago? Is it different now to what you're seeing the present day?
I think it's always going to be there. And I think, like Hannah said, we sort of see a spectrum, really. Like, we absolutely do still see young people and young adults with alcohol dependency, really entrenched, significant alcohol use. And they need, we've had young people that have had to be supported for detox, experiencing withdrawals, the real, high end of the scale. And then we still see young people that come in that might, go and binge drink on one occasion, drink too much, end up quite poorly and be completely put off. So, it's just this really wide spectrum. In terms of any shifts over my time working with young person services, I probably agree with Hannah and say that we do now see like pockets of young people that alcohol isn't part of their narrative, whereas actually before, pretty much everyone, it would be part of the narrative. That kind of contradicts what I was saying earlier, but I think there is a trickle coming through of young people that are just not interested, and some of that is because of the harms associated with that.
Yeah, I was going to say, is that more of like I guess what we would term in this field like more of a health-led approach to say, like, actually, you think of like cigarettes and how they were promoted even probably like 10 years ago, that they would be openly sold, and now, they're behind kind of shutters, you can't even see them, and obviously the reduction in tobacco and cigarette consumption is very much led by a public kind of health approach. It's led by harm reduction approach ultimately. Is that something that you ultimately then kind of attribute in terms of this kind of this little bit of shift in where alcohol isn't necessarily part of people's lives because of that approach?
Yeah, definitely. Like what Hannah was saying in terms of being at uni and there being like a sober society, like that would have just been absolutely unheard of when I went to uni. Like they probably would have been like bullied for being part of a sober society. So I think that shift is definitely there, and I do think that some of that may come from that sort of health and well-being angle.
Jamie, to bring you back in then, so obviously you head up both young person and adult services, but from an adult perspective, and obviously we touched on young people, like what kind of things are you seeing then within the kind of the adult population around alcohol? I kind of looking in terms of our stats, maybe we talked about it just before, actually, maybe a little bit skewed because we've taken on a service or two in the last couple of years, but looking at kind of like our referrals, like 2019, it was just over 2,000 referrals for alcohol, and just before the pandemic, March, well, I guess the pandemic kind of hit around March 2020, it creeped up to about 2,500. 3 years on, we're at over 4,000 referrals then for alcohol, and obviously to kind of put in that kind of note really that there is an additional service that came on board in between 2020 and 2023, but it doesn't account for that quite significant jump really in terms of those referrals. Is that something that you see within the adult population, that we're just seeing more and more people seeking support from our services for alcohol? And is it
Yeah.
is it kind of like, as a result, are you seeing less of other drugs?
Yeah, well, I think maybe sometimes it's like it can be like that. I know, because I think we've got, as an organization, and we've got like a no wrong door approach, and that's been developed over time and years of our services. And I think the ease of access into or entry into services then does increase naturally referrals. I think the work that we do as an organization to look at the people's first language matters also kind of breaks down those barriers for people accessing services. You think about alcohol and the current social issues that we have with, poverty, etc. You look at the COVID-19 period where we saw alcohol issues increase. We saw an increase in rise in DV. We've seen the increase in demand on DV provisions and services. We have seen an increase in domestic homicides, etc., and related to alcohol and drugs, etc. So we've definitely, I would say we would naturally see an increase in alcohol referrals because of that. But I think because of those aforementioned kind of issues and scenarios that we've been experiencing has definitely opened the floodgates. And I think that's what's now kind of we're seeing a representation of like more alcohol users within our cohort, and the demographics that we've seen has changed dramatically. Historically, if you think as a street agency, which was probably labeled more for opiate users because of our kind of well-established needle syringe programs, I think that was a barrier for people accessing our services, particularly in our area. However, I think with the work, as I said, we've been doing as an organization, I think that has assisted people to look and look for support. Our campaigns that we run, our social media presence, our online accessibility, chat, online chat facilities, those kind of things, where professionals and also individuals who are seeking support and advice can access. I think the most important thing is that getting the establishment of like a good sound harm reduction basis, so that we know that people don't need and don't have to come into services if they are drinking, and they need to know and understand. And so a good sound kind of like alcohol education and awareness, which we know we do quite well, does support the work that we do. But we also know that then there are times when individuals where we turn to alcohol, like we said, for all those historical reasons, all because of accessibility and ease and access of alcohol gets on top of individuals. Then we're there to be able to pick up and support those individuals. Obviously, then we got the health impact and the longer term impacts, and we've seen those bottlenecks within access and services for detox, assisted medication for alcohol use, and we see those longer waiting lists, probably higher thresholds to attain or access those services, which then kind of leads then to that kind of like log jam upstream, people staying longer in our services because they're not being able to move through the treatment system. And there's only so much like harm reduction advice and information and support you can give without that additional support which is needed because of the health impact. So there's a lot going on, and I think that's what we're kind of like looking at, reassessing services, looking at alcohol development pathways, alcohol liaison nurses in hospital, because people are obviously coming not just directly through our services now, but are finding their way through A&E or primary care because their health has been significantly compromised because of the alcohol use. So there's a lot to digest there that we're seeing as a street agency, but there's also a lot that we need, which is a food for thought for the future in how we develop our services in regards to a response to the current. Could we say it's a crisis? Would you say it's a crisis? Because we don't seem to be, it doesn't seem to be in the media as such, does it? But I think as a service, where I would say we're struggling with capacity wise, so I would say it's almost, we're bulging, we're at breaking point. And maybe that's what we need to be kind of like, mooting, is that there is an issue, and we need more support. And especially now it's November, we're coming up to December, Christmas period sometimes is a really difficult and challenging time for individuals. And where do we go from there then? So I've probably said there's a lot that we need to tackle there. But I wanted to encapsulate what we're currently seeing as a street agency, in the heart of the city centre in Swansea.
So it could be in terms of like, there's not necessarily more people drinking and more people experiencing the harms, but it could be that actually those pathways into services, there's so many more of them now. Like you mentioned, not to go over what you mentioned, but actually it's maybe easier to get into kind of tier 2 services, so to speak, in terms of like, your street agencies. When it comes to like detox and clinical services, maybe a bit more difficult, as maybe you kind of alluded to. But just the kind of the increase in accessibility could actually account for more people actually thinking, do you know what, it's maybe not as hard to seek that support.
Absolutely. And like I was saying, like, we work hard, don't we, to break down those barriers and the stigma attached to drugs and alcohol. And in our favour has come then the reward that people are more accepting, also finding that accessibility for them far easier than they have ever had before. And we get people who come in who got their own testimony saying, I would never have come here before, but I hear a lot about the work that you do. I see you on social media. I see the posts that you put out, and that is opening people's eyes to that kind of like, I need support, or I need to get into services to have some information, advice, to kind of do like an MOT to see where my drinking is at. Is it as bad as what I think it is? Is it as bad as what my partner is telling me it is? And if it's, and if we can confirm and deny that can support then someone with then how they continue to have that relationship with alcohol. So it's been really important that our services are accessible, because we want to be early intervention, not crisis stroke damage limitation. And by continuing to work on our increased accessibility points, our open door policy, then I think hopefully we could see that alcohol education awareness on a one-to-one level. And if you think about all the schoolwork that our services do provide in our localities, hopefully that could have an impact on people's relationship, or young people's relationship, as they develop and grow with alcohol. But we won't see that yet, will we? We're going to see it further on, and we've got to be mindful of, we've got this cohort of people that have come through COVID. They've their relationship has changed with alcohol, the government. We've also, which we haven't spoken about, is the unit pricing, alcohol unit pricing, which came around at the same time as COVID. So have we seen the benefits from that? Probably not. But that's a bigger debate, and that's another discussion to a side, I think. But there's loads of like caveats, I suppose, that come with that.
Yeah, I was reading, so the Senate did research last year, and they basically said that their terminology, not mine, drinkers reported that minimum unit pricing had little effect on their alcohol consumption, and changes to their drinking behaviour were overwhelmingly attributed to the COVID-19 pandemic rather than minimum pricing. Because it's a bit unfortunate, really, isn't it, in that it literally came in as COVID kind of hit, really, wasn't it? So it's quite hard to kind of to gather a strong kind of relationship, really, between minimum unit pricing and the consumption of alcohol as well. It's quite funny in terms of from the government. So I just want to kind of like mention, it came from the budget, I think the spring budget earlier this year. So the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, which I think is quite poignant given in terms of, as we're recording tomorrow, nitrous oxide, which is deemed a relatively low risk drug in terms of its harms compared to other substances, becomes a Class C drug. And there's lots of criticism around the kind of the criminalization of that and placing nitrous oxide on the Misuse of Drugs Act. But going back to that spring statement by the Chancellor, so what he said is that they actually used alcohol as a way to support the cost of living that we're going through. So as he exactly said, our penultimate cost of living measure concerns one of our most treasured community institutions, the Great British Pub. So, and then he went on basically to say what that was, which was to significantly increase the generosity of draft relief. So duty on draft products in pubs will be 11p lower than the duty in supermarkets. So the idea ultimately from that is that booze will be cheaper in a pub. So therefore to encourage people to go to the pub and drink rather than to buy their alcohol in the supermarket. And what I got from that was ultimately they're using alcohol as a way to as a stick really to say, look, this is what we're doing for you in these pretty hard times from a cost of a living perspective. It's also a way to gain support for Brexit, because they said that they wouldn't be able to do that kind of draft relief if they were still in the EU. So they're kind of using alcohol and people's relationship with alcohol to gain support for multiple things from that. But as I said, it's quite funny given then tomorrow, or as of tomorrow, nitrous oxide, which many will, as I said, kind of deem to be a lot less harmful than alcohol, is set to be a Class C drug.
I think that's really interesting that they're using alcohol and the money that they get from taxes of alcohol to support the cost of living, when actually alcohol contributes to so much of our alcohol harms contribute to so much of the social and economic costs in this country, like way more than.
Just think about like the NHS and the costs you get from any kind, because at the end of the day, if somebody gets heart disease and they have had an alcohol problem, you don't correlate it. Whereas like if somebody has a problem and you know that they were a known drug user, it gets correlated.
Even what is identified is still, it's almost double the cost from alcohol compared to illegal substances.
Yeah.
So I just think it's a really interesting point that they're then, it's really contradictory then that they're using that as a way of supporting economic recovery in this country. It's really.
I suppose on the other hand as well, though, is like getting people into pubs and socializing while they're drinking is better than people buying alcohol and drinking at home on their own. On the other hand, like the harm reduction we say is if you're going to use something, be with other people. If you're using a substance to socialize, and supporting that in a social aspect, and you're not just drinking to excess alone, then are you using that substance kind of for a healthy reason, or an okay reason?
And then it's taking it that one step further again by making sure that there are more options then for people to still continue to go out and socialize, but do it in a way where they don't have to or feel like the only option is to do that with alcohol. So making sure there are lots of like non-alcohol or low alcohol options in pubs and clubs and events, and everywhere that you go there is that choice. Because I think that's like what we were saying earlier about like when I went to uni, that just wasn't a choice, that wasn't an option. It didn't feel like it was a choice or an option. So
where do we stand then in terms of, like, say for example, alcohol-free drinks? So you got like alcohol-free beers and alcohol-free, so no prosecco, for example, or no secco. That's it. You got alcohol-free champagne and stuff. Like where as a service do you think we stand then? Can we promote that as like a harm reduction measure, do you think?
I think we can. It depends. It has to be needs led, doesn't it? You have to think about the person that you're working with and their story and where they're at with their treatment and what their needs are. But I think certainly, for young person services, and when we're working with young people and doing some of that information and education awareness raising around alcohol, it's about discussing that they are options, and you can use that as a harm reduction tool when you're going out. Obviously if you've got somebody really entrenched in alcohol dependency, then talking about buying a bottle of Prosecco is not necessarily going to be fit for purpose. But I think certainly with some cohorts of people that we work with, it's a really positive thing for us to be actively promoting.
I think it's good as a harm reduction tool in the sense of like, I know somebody I was working with, what we spoke about was because he was part of a rugby culture, and he was saying, I'd like to be able to have soft drinks in between my drinks, but the boys will, kind of take the mick out of me. And I said, well, if you ask for an alcohol-free beer or cider and ask for it to be poured into a glass, none of your mates are going to know.
Yeah.
So for him, that was his soft drink in between his alcoholic drinks, was an alcohol-free pint. And because it wasn't in a bottle, because it was in a glass, they couldn't tell. So that got his mates off his back. So I think, for some people, that's a really good kind of thing, especially for people as well who say they like the taste of alcohol, whereas other people might say, what's the point in that? If I wanted a soft drink, I would just have, some lemonade. So some people say I only drink the alcoholic drink to get the effects of the alcohol.
So it sounds like with like what you've kind of both like what we've all discussed really is there's an element of like sober shaming, isn't there? Really, and
I think so.
Do you find then in terms of whether for yourself or whether other people you come across and people kind of in services, and obviously taking that example you mentioned in terms of that individual just a minute ago, Han, that people have to explain themselves when they don't drink?
I think so. For me personally, it's if you say you're driving, it's left at that. To be fair to the people I kind of hang around with, they're very much like, okay, yes, don't drink if you're driving. I think so again, it depends on who you're friends with. It depends on who you socialise with, and it depends what the culture is. Like I think that you do have to explain why you're not drinking, but I think sometimes it's not necessarily because people are kind of peer pressuring you in the way that we imagine peer pressure. I think people sort of think, oh, come on, you should drink, you deserve to feel this way, you deserve the fun, I'm offering you this, I'm gonna buy you a pint because I like it, so I want to do this nice thing for you. I don't necessarily think it's peer pressure as we like envisage it, but I do think that there is like an explanation needed. I think with certain people I've socialized with in the past, if I've decided not to drink on a night out just because I don't fancy it or whatever, I've probably spent a good 2 or 3 minutes explaining why. But I also think, to be fair, you sometimes find yourself doing that and people are like, yeah, I don't really care.
Yeah.
And maybe you feel more that you have to explain why you're not, like you have to justify it to yourself why you're not drinking, as if you're convincing yourself, because it's so normal in society to be out in a pub and drink alcohol.
Yeah, absolutely. Sarah, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think I've experienced it from sort of all different levels. So I've had examples of that where I felt like, oh my God, I got into a situation and thinking, oh, I'm gonna have to really explain myself, and then people literally don't care. And then I've been in other examples where like I have had people like really questioning me and really struggling to understand it. I think for years I was a bit of a party girl, and I used to be the one that would always be kind of quite excessively binge drinking. And I think it's a shift for like my friendship group to see me not doing that anymore. So I think there's probably a part of them that's like just need a bit of time to get used to the fact that I don't really do that anymore. I'm too old to do it now anyway. I can't cope with it. But yeah, so I think I've experienced it on kind of lots of different levels. I've had it where like I've had bar staff saying to me, like when I've been in a group with a group of friends and everybody's ordered an alcoholic drink and I've ordered like soda and lime, and they're like, what is wrong with you? Why are you ordering soda and lime? And that I'm like, really? So yeah, I think you do get it in kind of all different levels, but the crux of it is it's just about being confident with it and being confident with your reasons why, and just sticking with that. And actually, people will have a split second thought about you, and then they'll go off and they'll be enjoying their night, whereas you can build it up in your own head and think you need to provide all this justification, but you don't.
So to wrap up then, so very quickly, so harm reduction message, what's your go-to? So if you had to give just one message, get it out there, what's your go-to? So Sarah, if we come to you first.
So we always used to do, well, we always do this exercise for young people. It's called Sober, Tipsy, Drunk. And you basically just, in a nutshell, ask, say, right, we're going on a night out. I want you to think about just before that night out, before you've started preloading, how are you feeling? Like, you know, really like get yourself into that mindset. What are you looking forward to about the night? You know, what are you planning? How are you feeling? What sort of vibe are you in? Get them to write a list of words. And then we say, okay, so now you're on your night out, you've had a couple of drinks and the alcohol's just starting to take effect. How are you feeling? What's going on? What are you looking like? What's the vibe here? List of words. And then, right, it's the end of the night. You've drunk way too much alcohol. You're absolutely hammered. What's going on? What are you feeling like? What are you looking like? What's the vibe? A list of words. And then you go through this 3 sets of words and say, right, okay, put a tick next to all the positive words and then a cross next to the negative words. And the neutral words, just put a tick and a cross. And 9 times out of 10, you'll have a list of positive words before they go out, a bit of a mix of the two whilst they're out, and then all negative at the end of the night. So then we say, okay, so ultimately, if you made that decision, you are going to drink. You want to keep yourself in that sort of sweet spot stage in the middle where the alcohol's just starting to take a little bit of an effect. You're getting what you feel are the positive effects from that. But we need to try and stop you tipping over into this list of really negative words at the end of the night. So what sorts of things can you do? Do you think realistically work for you to keep you in that sort of, that level? And ask them to come up with as many options that work for them, because there's no point in me saying, right, well, you need to drink water every other drink if that's not going to work for them. But it might be that they can say, right, well, I'll mix some tonic in with my drink, or, depending on where they're drinking and who they're drinking with, harm reduction messages that will sit with them and work for them. So yeah, that's in a nutshell a nice little activity, and I use that myself as well sometimes. If I'm ever tempted to go out and have a bit of a heavy session, I think, oh no, I don't want those list of negative words at the end of the night.
Cool, amazing. Thank you, Sarah. And Hannah, last words from yourself?
I think mine, I always do this with mine, is when we're talking about like pre-drinking. I always say to them, right, why do you pre-drink? And it's always the same reason. Is if I pre-drink, I'll spend less when I go out. And I always say to them, right, so if you're thinking, I don't want to spend 50 quid on my night out, I'll pre-drink first because I'll buy some in the shop, it's cheaper, and I'll go out. And then I ask them, how much do you end up spending when you go out after you've pre-drunk? And they always say 50 quid. And I'm like, well, you end up spending the same amount. You end up way more drunk. You can't remember the whole night. So what's the point in going to the shop and getting that crate or getting that bottle before you go out? And they're always like, oh, actually, that makes a lot of sense. So it's like giving yourself that head start when you go out so that you don't push to that extra level, because you will literally just end up spending the same amount or more because you're drunk once you get out, and then your wallet loosens up a bit. So yeah, we always have that conversation about trying to keep pre-drinking to a bit of a minimum.
Amazing, cool. Thank you both. So thank you to Hannah, thank you to Sarah, thank you to Jamie, who had to actually leave us a little bit earlier. Absolute part-timer, that man, I tell you. But yeah, thank you all, and hopefully we will see you all soon. Bye-bye. If you've been affected by the issues discussed in today's podcast, please reach out to your local GP, or you can call the Samaritans for free on 116 123. Barod is a charity that supports anybody affected by alcohol and other drug use, including friends and family members. So if you're based in South, West or East Wales and would like to access our services for yourself or gain information for a loved one, please visit our website at barod.cymru, and you can chat to a trained support worker 7 days a week via our live web chat service.